If World War III were to break out today, where would the fire start? One of the likeliest scenarios involves the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These former members of the Soviet Union joined NATO and the European Union in 2004, and Vladimir Putin has been very unhappy about it ever since. In fact, he resented the independence of the Baltic states from the day they freed themselves from Moscow's grip. Now, with Russia gaining ground in Ukraine, albeit at a steep price, the Baltic states are even more of a hotspot in world politics than they were a year ago, as the Kremlin harbors secret annexation plans, much like it has with Belarus. And it's not out of the question that Russia will use less than peaceful means to bring them back into its fold. But why do these three tiny states matter so much that Putin may be willing to risk even further escalation with the West? Let's take a look and see why these three seemingly small countries are much more important than you might think, and why this area in northeastern Europe is one of the likeliest starting points for a World War III. By themselves, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania do not cut significant figures on the world stage. They have a combined population of only 6.1 million people. Their economies aren't large either, with Estonia ranking 97th in the world, Latvia ranking 95th, and Lithuania ranking 79th. However, despite their small size, they sit on vital real estate, making them geopolitical hotspots. The Baltic states are highly vulnerable. To the north lies Russian territory in St. Petersburg, to the south lies the heavily fortified Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. In addition to some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, there are between 100,000 and 200,000 troops there, complete with long-range conventional missiles, artillery, and a vast electronic warfare network. To the east there is Russia's vassal state of Belarus. Starting in 2023, Russia deployed some of its tactical nuclear weapons there too, reactivating Cold War-era bases in Belarusian territory for this purpose. Russia has around 4,000 troops in Belarus, according to Ukrainian sources. However, there are an additional 20,000 troops on the border between Belarus and Russia as of January 2024. These troops could easily be deployed to invade Estonia and Latvia directly from Russian territory, or they could be sent through Belarus to attack Lithuania, particularly along the Suwalki Gap, NATO's most vulnerable geographic point. The Suwalki Gap is a 62-mile stretch of border between Poland and Lithuania. Belarus sits on the eastern end of this line, while Kaliningrad is to the west. This small but volatile piece of real estate came into the crosshairs in June 2022. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lithuania announced that its national railway would prohibit certain goods leaving Kaliningrad to transit through its territory. These goods included coal, metal, and building materials, amounting to about 50% of the total commerce coming from Kaliningrad across the Suwalki Gap. Anton Alikhanov, the governor of Kaliningrad, responded by saying that Lithuania's move was a serious violation. A pincer operation along this narrow stretch of land would secure a long-desired land bridge to Kaliningrad from Russian territory and cut the Baltic states off from the rest of NATO by land. Russian forces would greatly outnumber the militaries of the Baltic states along this narrow front. Once the Suwalki Gap is secured, Russian forces in the south will be able to sweep northward to create another pincer on the Baltic states, with their comrades coming from Russian and Belarusian territory from the east. Russia has historically sought naturally defensible borders. Unfortunately for Moscow, because the country sits at the broadest part of the European plain, it's hard to acquire natural defensible frontiers. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia's border with NATO was about 766 miles. The entrance of Finland into the alliance in 2023 added 830 more miles of border to defend. Annexing the Baltic states would reduce this border by about 316 miles by removing the existing border with Estonia and Latvia. It would also give Russia a much more naturally defensible border, since it would now sit on the Baltic Sea. Defenses in the area could be linked up with the fortifications and garrisons in Kaliningrad thanks to the new land bridge. This would create a formidable defense network, acting as a severe threat to Poland and Finland. Russia would also reverse its fortunes in the Baltic Sea. Thanks to Sweden's recent entry into the alliance, the Baltic is now a NATO lake, with Russia left with only two small rumps of territory there, around Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. This is a complete reversal of the situation that prevailed in the Cold War, where the Baltic was for all practical purposes a Soviet lake. In the event of a Russian annexation of the Baltic states, Russia will be able to project more power into the sea and restore a more favorable balance with NATO there. The Baltic Sea is one of the world's busiest shipping areas and vital to the economy of Europe. Roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade transits through these confined waters, including much of the trade in Russia's vital energy industry. Even now, a third of Russia's crude oil exports come in tankers, which move through the Baltic and past the Danish Straits. Before the invasion, all of Russia's oil exports through the Baltic went to Europe. Some of these exports still do, but the lion's share of them now go to Egypt, Turkey, India, and even China. Increased energy purchases from China, India, and Turkey in particular have proven vital in Russia's ability to stabilize its economy following the sanctions imposed by Western countries and their allies from February 2022 onward. Russia has avoided the worst and has been able to sustain its war effort thanks to these new relationships. However, its loss of nearly all power in the Baltic means that its trade remains vulnerable, and it now has almost no say in the course of commerce that goes through this narrow and busy area. Cutting off this trade would devastate Russia. Securing the Baltic states would not solve the issue of the Danish choke points, an issue which has haunted Russia throughout its history, but restoring balance in the sea is still vital for Moscow if it wants a more credible deterrent against NATO. Being able to threaten the shipping of NATO countries would help to keep its own maritime trade secure. But Putin is not interested in the Baltic states simply for strategic reasons. Above all, he is an ideological revanchist. He is famous for referring to the fall of the Soviet Union as a tragedy that reversed centuries of Russian territorial and cultural expansion. He further claimed that the Soviet Union's collapse separated the people of Russian ethnicity or cultural ties from their historical motherland. In his 2021 essay that most consider his justifications for the invasion of Ukraine, entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin argued that extreme Ukrainian nationalists sponsored by the Western powers were attempting to further separate the people of historical Russian civilization from one another, even enlisting neo-Nazi elements to do so. The large presence of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within Ukraine's borders further lent to his arguments that Ukraine had not been a historical nation separate from Russia. Furthermore, he believed that these Russians needed protection from the radical elements sponsored by the West. Putin viewed Ukraine's internationally recognized borders as ahistorical constructions imposed on the world by the Western powers. Historians roundly dismissed his claims as propaganda, but he had power, and he nevertheless used it to invade Ukraine, whether he believed in his propaganda or not. This is bad news for the Baltic states, particularly Estonia and Latvia. 25% of their respective populations are composed of ethnic Russians. Lithuania's population is only 4.5% Russian, but it shares the historical experiences of its neighbors. All three of the Baltic states were annexed by the expanding Russian Empire in the 18th century. The three only declared their independence from Russian control in 1918, following Russia's defeat in World War I and the dissolution of the empire. The Soviet Union did not meekly accept this, however, and as a consequence of World War II, all of the Baltic states were put back under Moscow's control. Independence was regained from the weakening and fall of the Soviet Union. Lithuania declared its independence from Moscow again in 1990, even before the Soviet Union's end. Today, the Baltic states are heavily integrated into the economic and cultural spheres of the West. Their ethnic majorities view themselves as culturally Western, especially the generation born after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states are becoming more integrated with the West in other ways. One of the few remaining ties to the Russian sphere of influence is through their respective power grids. Following the Soviet Union's downfall, the Baltic states remained part of the same power grid with Russia and Belarus. All three are now in the midst of integrating their electrical networks with Europe and plan to leave the post-Soviet grid at the end of next year. Russia views this plan as a threat. In addition to these historical and strategic factors, there is another factor which may make the Baltic states even more of a hotspot: Russia's limited window of opportunity. Russia's fertility rate is 1.826 births per woman. This is up from the lows seen in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but still significantly below replacement level. Demographers predict that by the end of the century, Russia's population will fall from its current 144 million to 112 million. A falling population not only means fewer people, but an increase in a country's average and median ages. There will be fewer young people to serve in the military, keep the economy running, and create new products and innovations to spur growth in the future. This slow but steady demographic transition means that Russia is running out of time to regain the lost territories and people that were once part of the Empire or the Soviet Union. It need only look to its rival Ukraine to see a preview of its future. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers was between 30 and 35 when the war began, but has risen to 43 before the end of 2023. The age may get lower as Ukraine inevitably revises its draft laws to conscript younger people into the ranks, but this will not take away from the broader trend of aging soldiers. Similar data is not available for Russian soldiers, although they are thought to be a little younger on average than their Ukrainian counterparts. Nevertheless, those soldiers are old by the standards of most wars. In World War II, the average age of a soldier in the Red Army was likely in the early 20s based on casualty data. As Russia ages, it can expect to face similar problems in its military. It will also need to spend more money on elder care. Point being, if Russia wants to reclaim its imperial and Soviet borders and bring its ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diaspora back under Moscow's control, it must do so in relatively short order, before the effects of an aging population set in and it finds itself forced to return inward to deal with the problem. Russia's strategic partner China is facing a similar conundrum, which is why many national security officials in Washington fear an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine 2 years ago, much as it shook a world that had largely come to believe that conflict was a thing of the past, it's not surprising in this historical and demographic context. Like Germany before World War I, Russia and China are two aspirants to greater world power at the expense of the order created by the existing hegemon, in this case the United States, and like the German Empire, their relative power in the international system is now at a high point, with a decline coming. The fact that these two countries are motivated by a historical revanchism makes them all the likelier to initiate conflict in the near future if they believe that the costs will not be too high. At first glance, the cost has not been worth it. Putin believed Ukraine would fall without too great an effort, so he launched his invasion. He did not get the short victory he envisioned and has paid dearly in men and material. It's unclear what an acceptable victory even looks like for Russia at this point, despite the slow advances it's made in 2024. But only Putin has the most important piece of information, whether all of the losses Russia has suffered in the war and the economic isolation from most of the world's advanced economies has all been worth it. He is the only one with that information because as a dictator, he is the only one that can make the decisions. If Putin believes that the war in Ukraine has been worth it despite the losses, the Baltic states are in much greater danger. Russia already has annexation plans involving Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Documents leaked to Swedish media in 2023 revealed a multi-stage approach. First, the Kremlin seeks to change attitudes toward NATO in the Baltic states. Through the influence of NGOs and the cultivation of relationships with friendly politicians, it hopes to promote closer cooperation with Russia and stop the Baltic states from leaving the post-Soviet power grid. By 2030, Moscow hopes that the Baltic states will view NATO as a danger to their national security. These documents were drawn up in 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine, and it's likely that their authors in the Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts did not know that their leader was planning to invade Ukraine. The plan's already unlikely prospect of coming to fruition is all but impossible now. With peaceful annexation, or at least reincorporation into the Russian sphere of influence off the table, will Moscow resort to grey zone operations or even all-out war to bring the Baltic states back into its orbit as it did in Ukraine? Unlike Ukraine, the Baltic states are all under Article 5 protection from the North Atlantic Treaty. This acts as a powerful deterrent, and the entrance of Sweden into NATO has helped to relieve some of the security pressures on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Before Sweden arrived, an attack on the Suwalki Gap would have left these three NATO members completely cut off from their allies. Thanks to Sweden, though, there is now a direct sea route to keep the Baltic states supplied, even if the land connection with Poland is cut. Supplies and reinforcements could be gathered in Swedish territory and sent to the Baltic states. This would increase the costs incurred on the invading Russian forces and slow their momentum as they tried to take territory. The presence of Sweden and its Gripen fighters and submarines also adds more intelligence to NATO's arsenal, reducing Russia's prospects for surprise even further. Nevertheless, Russia would inevitably have a numerical advantage on this front, and we have seen in Ukraine how much this has mattered. The line would be narrower too, and the Russian military has absorbed many of the lessons on modern warfare it has been taught the hard way by its Ukrainian foe, such as the importance of drones and precision-guided artillery fire. More recently, Russia has adapted to the demands of modern trench warfare by using lighter vehicles like pickup trucks, all-terrain vehicles, and even motorcycles to ferry troops while transporting supplies by golf carts. These vehicles are the linchpin for smaller units using mobile tactics, often night raids, and often come armed with small artillery guns or anti-tank guided missiles. Some of the vehicles can carry loads of up to 3 tons, but they still have cruising speeds of almost 100 miles per hour. This is important because while Ukrainian FPV drones have cost Russia dearly in its traditional military vehicles, these small, often unarmored vehicles are much harder for those drones to target. The Ukrainians had once pioneered these light unit anti-drone tactics, but the Russians have learned from their enemies. These modern stormtrooper-style tactics have been one of the keys to Russia's slow but steady advances across previously unassailable land in 2024. They have had some success in breaking through the screen of Ukrainian FPV drones. The success of these tactics might act as a further enticement for Russia to view an invasion of the Baltic states as a more realistic possibility. Their much smaller territorial extent than Ukraine make them much more ideal for a fast takeover. And if Moscow thinks it has learned enough lessons to overcome Western tactics and equipment, the chance for an invasion of the Baltic states increases. The only thing stopping this more aggressive Russia from invading the Baltic states is their alignment with NATO. When interviewed by Politico in the summer of 2022, the people of Lithuania expressed a high degree of confidence that their NATO allies would come to their defense in the event of an attack on the Suwalki Gap. However, security experts have noted that the invocation of Article 5 for something as otherwise insignificant as the Suwalki Gap remains untested. In theory, the North Atlantic Treaty obligates all members to come to the defense of an ally under attack, no matter how small. However, as NATO grew larger, some national security experts wondered whether the expansion would expose its older members to vulnerabilities it would not in practice want to mobilize force for. Would countries like the United States or Turkey come to the defense of small and faraway countries like the Baltic states if they were attacked? In the case of Lithuania, for example, would the other members of NATO want to risk a wider war and maybe even a nuclear confrontation for the sake of a largely uninhabited stretch of land along a remote 62-mile border? The American public, for example, is war-weary, and aid to Ukraine has proven controversial in its divided politics. Would the public accept a deployment to Eastern Europe to defend this seemingly inconsequential part of the world? This question is not a mere abstraction. China has already proven the concept in the South China Sea when it seized control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. This piece of real estate falls under the Philippines' exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China, however, gambled that the Philippines would not use military force to defend it, much less any of its allies. It has done the same with its expansion into the rest of the South China Sea, ultimately betting correctly that no one would raise too serious a challenge to defend the international status quo. A court finding in 2016 invalidated all of China's claims, but it has ignored the ruling. Russia has watched the progress of its strategic partner carefully. While increased aggression against the Baltic states as it remains at war with Ukraine seem out of the question, what will happen when the conflict concludes? If Russia walks away with more substantial gains than expected, would Western leaders be willing to use military force to defend the Baltic states in the face of grey zone and salami-slicing operations, or even an outright annexation, as Russia has reportedly planned? What do you think? Is this small part of northeastern Europe one of the likeliest places for World War III to start? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying Baltic states, or click this other video instead.